This is the Lazy Women podcast.
Hello and welcome to the Lazy Women podcast. I'm Lauren, part of the Lazy Women team, and today I'll be talking to Ellie Sugden, who is co-founder of Our Generation for Inclusive Peace, also known as OGIP. We're going to be talking about the feminist principles behind OGIP and how these are applied in practice, but more broadly about how this work is done on an entirely voluntary basis and the realities of fitting this in alongside paid work and how to still make time for some laziness. So let's get started. Ellie, welcome. And can you give us a bit of an introduction to yourself and tell us about OGIP and how it was founded?
Hello, thank you for having me. I'm Ellie Sugden. I'm one of the co-founders of Our Generation for Inclusive Peace. I'll get on to who we are and what we do in a second. Just for context around what else I do, I also am a technical manager at a small watchdog and research organisation called AGULUS, Applied Knowledge, and we scrutinise how aid is done. And within that, I spend a lot of my time looking at the equity around aid, looking at gendered approaches and feminist approaches to how aid is done, and working on governance, anti-corruption and peace-building programming. So onto OGIP. It is a grassroots, youth-led advocacy and research organisation that is trying to shake up the power structures and systems around the women, peace, security and youth, peace and security agendas, and how these block who has the power and the voice and engagement in furthering these agendas. So we're basically trying to bring in more young, and in particular, young women's voices from conflict zones in particular, because we're working in the peace building space, into conversations, into the power structures that exist within the sector. So we do that through three pillars. So our first pillar is research, and I can talk a bit as to how feminism kind of is interwoven into all of the principles later. But we basically try to produce research that isn't embedded in lots of the rigor of the editing processes that are often entrenched in like Western formatting styles. And they're often written pieces of articles that make peace building sector quite unapproachable. So we produce lots of research that is poetry and spoken word and art. And the idea is that this isn't produced by people in the West, which is where the predominant amount of peace building research has traditionally come from. So we're aiming to get young people to be producing that research and then circulating it amongst each other. So that's the research pillar. Then we have the partnerships pillar, which is where we partner with other organizations in the space trying to do the same thing. And then we have the advocates pillar. And within that, we have an advocates network. And we have, I think now, around 34 youth advocates from around the world. And we basically try to bring them into the big conversations that are happening at a multilateral level, so UN institutions, etc., to make sure that there are voices represented of people who are doing grassroots peace activism in conflict zones. So that leads on to how OGIP was founded. Essentially, it was, I think most young people, when they go into a sector that they've always wanted to work in, feel a bit disillusioned. And I think that's incredibly stark in the aid sector. It's entrenched in a lot of old power structures. Lots of people, will say that aid is essentially just an old form of colonialism. And we all went into the aid sector and peace building in particular and noticed that when youth were asked to be represented at events, it was people like me with Western education and no experience of living through a conflict zone, and therefore only able to bring academic experience into that place. And also that youth were, when we were in those meetings, we were only called upon to talk about youth-based issues, so not being seen as experts within our own right, within the wider field of the peace building sector. And we're often just taking notes and whatever, so not meaningfully contributing. So we wanted to change that. So it's a way to make sure that the voices of people represented are young people who actually know what it is to live in a conflict zone and therefore know what solutions are going to work, and alongside that, we advocate for their inclusion to be meaningful, and for youth to actually be seen as experts. So that is why it was founded, and that is a little sprinkle of what we do.
No, it's amazing. It's really, really interesting to hear about all the different strands. And obviously, it's such important work. And I'm sure there's a lot of people kind of grateful that, you and somebody at least is championing these kinds of topics. And so when you founded the organization, why did you kind of decide to make it focused on feminist principles, even though the work itself centers around peace and security? And when you're trying to apply those feminist principles, does it look different in the three different strands that you've talked about?
Yeah, it does look slightly different, but we have like an overarching intersectional feminist framework. And I think the intersectional bit is key. It's an interesting question because I apply it to my day job as well. I don't think for the past 3 or 4 years, anything I've done now in a work sense has been without me trying to bring in a proper feminist framework. Because I think when you're trying to, and again, I will say feminist, but I mean intersectional feminist. So I mean a framework that is properly deconstructing power structures and looking at equity and looking at race and looking at disability. When you're trying to reimagine, I guess, which is what we are trying to do at OGIP, a whole sector, and you want it to be grounded in building a better world, a more equitable world. I just think a feminist framework is the only way that you can really do that. And it's really helpful to have principles then to frame what you're trying to do, because it can feel really loose. So for us, you can do this thing called a feminist audit. And the first phrase of that is getting an understanding of what being a feminist organization means. And then you can have principles for you and for your organization, for your mission and what you're trying to do. And then you have principles that you can interweave into the specifics and the nuance of what you're doing. So basically why it was founded in it is, if we're trying to reimagine it, a system, and we want it to be more equitable, and we want to change who is deemed as an expert and the voices that are brought into that space, I think feminism was just like the only way to make sure that you're doing that properly. And it provides a nice structure for you to do it properly, instead of it being something you talk about and saying you want to do. So we do, for how we do that for the research pillar, we have a research group which is outsourced from the core group of OGIP. So we have a group of co-founders and volunteers who work with us, and we do the grunt work essentially. But any decisions that are made via our community. So that's our advocates network that I spoke about. And then we also created a separate research body, and they choose the themes of research we do. So recently we did something called Power, Politics and People on the Move. And then the one before that, I think, was after COVID, and it was about feminist rebuilding and reconstruction and how we could hopefully reimagine a better world after COVID, which has not happened. But all of those decisions are made by a research group, which is made up of young activists from all over the world. So it's not like a Western hub deciding on what and driving what research is done. And then they control the editing process as well. So how we've tried to be feminist there is by having a flat structure and making sure that decisions aren't made with like one group who have the power because they're the co-founders or whatever. It's all outsourced to our community. And then how we do that in the advocacy network, again, is by transferring the power to them. So for any speaking opportunity that we get, that is never taken up by OGIP co-founders. That's always outsourced to our network. They're the knowledge source, not us. And then whenever we're asked to produce a piece of activism, so like a research note or comment on something, for example, we're part of this UN Women Compact, that is always being outsourced to them. So they're our knowledge hub. And how we do that in the partnerships pillar is just by being really clear what our principles are, and then for being really strict about who we partner with. Yeah, so those are some of the ways in which we do it. I think for us, being a feminist organization means having a flat structure. So it's trying to outsource and make sure that power is equally distributed, and it's distributed away from the co-founders who are traditionally, although this is changing now, predominantly based in the global north. We set OGIP up because we acknowledge that we shouldn't be the ones with the power and shouldn't be the experts. So we try to be as mindful as we can about spreading out power and influence.
Yeah, thank you for delving into that a little bit more. I think you've made some really, really important points there, and probably given some others a lot of food for thought as well, especially if they're, involved in or even leading other voluntary organisations. And I really like the sound of the feminist audit that you mentioned, and maybe we can include a link about how another organisation might do that in the show notes, just so that people can have a chance to read about it in a bit more detail. And so, obviously, we've said that this work is in addition to your full-time kind of paid job. Is that the same for all colleagues and co-founders at OGIP? Or do most of you at least work on a voluntary basis? And how does that feel to try and be fitting this in with your kind of full-time day job, as you say?
Yeah, so we all work on a voluntary basis, which is incredibly normal for a youth-based organisation, and also for any organisation or initiative, I think, that is trying to work against the power structures that we have in place at the moment, or trying to change a specific work culture or whatever. It tends to always be an initiative that's started up and isn't paid. And what does it mean and how does it feel? It feels very frustrating at times, especially as you get older, I think, and you understand the importance of remuneration and the realities of it just become a bit more stark. It can get really disheartening and frustrating. And also, I think, we're here on a Lazy Women podcast, and we're going to be talking a bit more about rest shortly. You begin to understand how important rest is, right? And how important coming to these spaces where you're trying to push for change, how important it is to come to these spaces feeling well rested. And the reality is that you come and you do this work in like a couple of hours that you've managed to scavenge at the end of your work day, or you do it, which is what I predominantly do, on your Sunday, which means you are less rested and you're coming to this space with less rigor and less innovative ideas. And collectively, we are all really tired, including our advocates network. For the past couple of years, we started off with so much energy and enthusiasm. And now when we meet up, the beginning of our session is always, talking about how we're struggling to balance everything, and all of us giving each other tips and actually talking about feminist principles. One thing we're really mindful of is like that we don't have strict timelines on anything, because I think, one, you can't impose that when you're not paying people for their time. But two, I think that's a really important part of feminism, is recognizing that women in particular at the moment, in the kind of culture that we have, are just perpetually tired. And you need to create, space for people to be able to contribute in the best ways that they feel like they can. Yeah, so it feels really frustrating. And I also think that this work isn't paid because it slows it down, basically. I think you're never paid to change the system, right? And it's a product of that. And I think it can be why change is so slow, because you only have XYZ number of people being able to work to push things forward. I do think there is actually quite a positive change, though, in a lighter side of things. I work a lot on equity, and like in my day job, lots of the research I'm doing at the moment, policy production I'm doing at the moment, is for organizations looking to become more equitable. And previously, all of that work would have been done in-house, right, by learning groups or groups of younger colleagues, traditionally starting something. Like after George Floyd was murdered and the Black Lives Matter movement happened, I think every single organization had a group of young people rise up and try to change their workplace culture. And now that work is finally being outsourced and being paid for, which is how it should be done. It shouldn't be being done alongside of day jobs of people who probably are the ones who are marginalized anyway. So I think there is a positive change to this kind of work being paid, but it's incredibly slow.
Yeah, no, thank you. And I think you definitely raised some points that we often talk about within Lazy Women, the kind of work that is deemed worthy of remuneration in the kind of capitalist structures that most of us are still kind of living in and trying to dismantle in a, small, meaningful way. And it is kind of, it can be really disheartening, and I think it can be really kind of difficult to try and keep momentum, especially especially for young people, yeah, but also, as you say, as you get a bit older, when you've got a little bit more experience and you start to understand the importance of remuneration and how that relates to the capacity to rest, and how the capacity to rest relates to the contribution that you can make to making these changes. It's a cycle of one needing to feed into the other, really, and we kind of we can't be productive and unless we have time to rest or to be lazy.
And also on that as well, so you're just prompting it, it also keeps out who is engaging in particular spaces. It means it is typically white Western privileged people, just because that's the way that society is structured. But also just talking about rest and then kind of thinking about who's excluded and how that shifts demographics. I was at a book launch for Michaela Loach's book, It's Not That Radical, which is all about just transitions and fighting climate change. And she quoted something that Black women in the UK were found in a recent research study to have, I think it was like 45% less rest than white women. And then I remember seeing this Vice article, I think it was a year or two ago, and it was about this exhibition called Black Power Naps. And it was literally just Black people going into sleep in a museum because they're so bloody tired. Oh, I don't know if I'm allowed to swear, but because they're so tired. But we have to think about that as well. If you want to create, so therefore the people who have more energy and time, and frankly, because of the way, society is structured, money, are going to be white privileged people who, in the context of OGIP and what we're trying to do, but also I think in the ethics of what lazy women believe in as well, we're trying to create a more equitable world. So, like how do we balance that out, basically? And one way to do that is remuneration.
No, absolutely. And you are allowed to swear, so don't worry
Right.
about that. So yeah, linking to that then, how do you, with all these things going on, with all these kind of, I guess, demands on your time from your day job and everything else that, needs to get done in life. Plus, you said that there's no kind of hard timelines with OGIP, which I think is a really, really interesting concept. But obviously you do there's an element of wanting to keep things moving forward. But how do you look after yourself, and what does being a lazy woman or lazy woman mean to you? How do you try and fight these expectations that we have to be productive and living up to certain norms kind of 24/7?
Yeah, I am very much a work in progress on this one. So personally, how do I look after myself, and how am I a lazy woman? So I think for me, I have a lot of guilt around being lazy sometimes. So something that's been really helpful for me is linking to what we were just talking about before. So justifying the why to myself of why it's so important for me to rest. So recognizing that I'm a better friend, I'm a better sister, and I'm better at work. And therefore, my work is very aligned with my purpose, which is trying to, everything that we've just talked about, right? So I can show up more radically and more mindfully when I'm rested. So that helps me feel, I guess, less guilty when I slow down and I rest a bit. And I think that's really helped me recently. But another thing is I was having less structure around my rest, which sounds counterproductive, but I think I'm naturally quite a restless person, and having a routine for some people, I think for context, Lauren and I know each other. For some people, routine is incredibly comforting and then allows you to rest more. And it's the same for most people I love in my life. My sister, for example, loves a routine. And for myself, I thought I needed one in order to be able to rest better. And actually, that's just been really counterproductive to me. And I've realized I need different type of rest for different type of things, basically, depending on how I feel on a certain day. I was actually chatting to one of my friends, Trisha, who's a life coach, and she was talking about how tired all of her clients are at the moment. We were chatting about rest, and she mentioned, I'm sure we can all go and Google it and see the nuance of it, but apparently the 7 different types of rest that you need depending on the type of tired that you are. And that kind of, just hearing that made sense to me, because I basically realized, sometimes I need to go and lie on the sofa with my sister and be a vegetable and watch TV. But sometimes I'm really tired, and what I need actually is to go out for dinner with one of my best friends and have a really good chat and kind of, good friends can sometimes bring you back to yourself and give you energy when you feel completely deflated. You realize that's what you need. Sometimes what I need is to go and do a yoga class. Sometimes what I need is to go have an early bed. Sometimes what I need is to read a book and escape into my brain. And sometimes what I need, it changes completely on the day. So not having structure around my rest and actually thinking every day about what type of rest I need. And I've realized that for me, resting means switching my brain off. I think that was another really helpful thing for me was figuring out how I was feeling rested. So something that helps me lose track of time and where I'm not thinking. So that can be being in a dance class when someone's shouting at me and telling me what to do and I'm trying to remember a routine, or it can be reading a book and like escaping into a different world that switches my brain off. So that's how I'm trying to approach rest at the moment.
Hi ladies, it's Aisha, and the most important thing I do for myself to claim my laziness is probably my morning routine, because I have never been a morning person and it has always been a bit challenging for me to gather my thoughts and start working in the morning. And if I have to quickly get ready and leave the home, I find it difficult to start my day and I feel usually more anxious. That's why I try to set my wake up time half an hour or 1 hour earlier and give myself some calm and much needed time at home, because it allows me to feel the beginning of the day before opening my mailbox or seeing the chaos and traffic in the city. Sometimes I have a cup of hot tea or coffee and read a few pages under my blankets, or sometimes I do a short yoga flow and stretch. I realize that if I do this, I feel less exhausted at the end of the day. And to have a break during the day, my best tactic is to listen a 10 minutes short fairy tale from a narrator I enjoy during my coffee break, because it helps me to take my mind to different worlds, different realities, and it really gives me energy.
Hi, this is Lauren, and the one thing that I try to do every single day to add a bit of laziness into what can be quite a hectic work and life schedule is to read a book before bed. Ideally, this would be a full hour, but in reality, sometimes it's just 5 minutes or even just one page. But I always make sure that the last thing I do before going to sleep is reading a physical book and having something to soothe my mind and send me off to get sleep with something nice to think about. I also try to make sure most times that at least half my week evenings are without any social plans, so that I can catch up on life admin or chores or work if needed, or try and have some time just to myself to watch TV or read or cook something delicious. So yeah, they're my tips.
It's difficult to pay attention and incorporate regular laziness into our lives, but once you've done it, there is no turning back. One thing I learned from my unemployed era is that breakfast, lunch and dinner times are sacred. That means I sit down and instead of eating my food as quickly as possible, I try to make the experience enjoyable with small things like preparing a pretty drink for the side or using nice cutlery. That serves as a constant reminder for me to put my needs before the hustle, but I am fortunate in that I'm not required to be in a rush every day.
For me, the question that comes to my mind related to the topic of workplace and rest is, how can we separate or decouple the idea of rest from getting ill? Because often I feel that the only time when you're allowed to rest, when you're really allowed to rest without guilt, is when you're forced to rest, especially when you're working in a traditional work environment where you need to be in the office 5 times a week. And the only way you can allow yourself some rest from that busy schedule is to call in sick. But what if the idea of rest was allowed as part of your work? What if you didn't have to lie every time you couldn't sleep, every time you had a bad night? What if those things were part of our everyday work culture? What would that mean for the idea of rest to be more than something that you need to apologize for?
I feel like for many of us, rest doesn't come about naturally. We need to learn how to rest, or in some cases, learn it again. I remember from my childhood, my mum spending most of her time running around and cleaning, and grandma constantly trimming the garden or something, rarely finding the time to basically just sit down, and enjoy their coffee and do nothing. And whenever I wanted to spend a day on a sofa and just read a book, I was almost always nudged to basically get up again and make myself useful. There was this fear of laziness, but also the necessity to use the weekends to catch up on everything that didn't manage to get done during the week, which meant that passive rest didn't really have space in our house. Your choice, especially as a woman, was to run around frantically and, if you felt ironic enough, even call it active rest. Nothing much more than that, really. Now as an adult, I'm learning to be much more strict with myself when it comes to resting time, because I know how quickly my imprinted workaholism leads to burnout. As a night owl, I have a very slow morning routine, mostly spent indulging my coffee, to be honest. But I'm also a big yoga fan and try to get on a mat at least 3 or 4 times a week, even if only for 20 minutes or so. When it comes to work, I'm trying to turn off my notifications after 6 p.m. and not to answer any emails in the evenings. I also rarely sleep with an alarm clock to really nourish my sleeping cycle, but I know that's a privilege only a few of us can afford, so I feel really lucky for that. And when everything gets a bit too overwhelming, I just shut the computer off and take some time for myself, be it a warm shower, a walk outside, a glass of wine, or a few minutes of skincare. More often than not, these moments are exactly what my brain needed to refresh and mean that I can show up the next day, much more energized and ready to continue. I still sometimes fail to take time off, especially when things get really busy, but I'm doing my best at listening to what my body truly needs and no longer attempt to ignore or suppress these feelings, which is something I used to do before.
Yeah, amazing. And it's quite ironic, isn't it? Because you've almost got to put time and effort into figuring out which kind of rest works for you at different times, and even that requires headspace in itself to be in the moment enough where you realize not only what you need, but then how does whatever activity you decide to turn to make you feel. You've got to be kind of cognizant of that in order to then re-implement it at the times that you recognize you need it.
Yeah, it's so unfair that rest can't just be simple.
And so in terms of like how that relates then or reflects as a woman in the workplace, which is kind of a key theme for Lazy Women this month, do you have any advice? And you mentioned earlier that sometimes you kind of share some advice and tips at the beginning of your OGIP meetings, but do you have anything that you could share with us today for how we as women can be ambitious and fulfilled while also kind of looking after ourselves and putting boundaries in place, which, I think is especially difficult for women, but especially those in the early stages of a career as well, where, you're still trying to kind of impress, you want to make an impact. But as you say, you need to recognize that resting helps you, be able to show up better, be able to show up in a more vivid way.
For younger women especially, it's so interesting, isn't it? It's so hard because I remember having this there's just this urgency that loads of young women have when you're at the early stages of your career. And it's so hard. I think one of the solutions is us all speaking about it more as women and making sure that we're speaking to all women within our organization at different levels about it, because, you know, when I was younger, if someone told me to rest more, I just wouldn't have listened. And now I'm older, I just wish I could have told my younger self how much more time I had, and told myself to take it easy a bit more. And it's so interesting as well, just you bringing in like how difficult it is, especially for women, because before we started recording today, I was thinking about how I was thinking about rest and the gender dynamics of it, and realizing that at least in my world, all of my female friends, I'm sorry, I'm being gender binary here, but all of my female friends have something that they do on the side that is occupying their traditional rest time, you know, because it's, you know, work structures were set up for you to have a 9 to 5 and then you go home and sleep. And that's all kind of created around, the workplace was designed for men, wasn't it? So they'd go home and they wouldn't have to cook their own bloody dinners and put their children to bed, X, Y, Z. So the work structures are already not created for women. And then you add on top of that, I think all humans are very multifaceted, but I think women are just more aware of the breadth of what they can do, and therefore are branching out into doing what you're doing. You're doing lazy women on the side, and I have friends making jewelry on the side. I have friends being life coaches on the side, being yoga teachers on the side. Like, everyone has a thing pretty much now. And I think we need to call into question why we're doing that sometimes. Like, we don't need to monetize all of our hobbies and all of our passions and make them, maybe it's not even monetizing, but it's something about capitalism that makes you feel like you need to make a thing out of them. But I think as women, we need to ask ourselves sometimes why we are occupying our rest space with trying to be more productive and like creating something to put out there. Like, sometimes we are allowed to just indulge in, let's say, our creativity without it needing to be an output. I think lots of women at the moment are feeling pressure to capitalize on what they do to rest. And I think that can be incredibly empowering. And, you know, women deserve and need more bloody pay in the world, because everything is inequitable. And part of me thinks it's an awesome thing, but parts of me is also like worried about this shift that I'm recognizing. And like, if we think about our friendship group, it is mainly the women who have their side hobbies. I can't think of many of my male friends who do. Yeah, I think just tips is questioning and talking about things with your friends and colleagues about why we're all exhausting ourselves and what we're doing for rest, and leading by example on talking about resting, I think is important. Finding your why, as I said earlier, that has helped me rest more.
I think that's a really nice summary, though. I mean, jump back in if it comes to you, but I think that's a really nice summary. And I think there's a lot of food for thought that you've mentioned there, which is a really kind of nice way to perhaps wrap up this conversation. Is I almost think people can rewind the last 5 minutes and get their journals out with a pen and really kind of ponder some of those points that you've just mentioned. And I think I should also probably add you for context as well, when me and Ellie are talking about kind of getting older, or women at the kind of start of their careers, we ourselves are approaching 30. Some of us faster than others, but we're approaching 30, so we definitely still have a lot to learn from, hopefully many years to come, and are very much still learning from those women who are older than us. But I think we can both definitely testify that we've had quite a big shift in learning in the last kind of 7 or 8 years, or since we've graduated from university and worked in different paid and unpaid work contexts. So by no means are we experts. I think, Ellie, you said earlier, you're still a work in progress in terms of how you feel about laziness and how you feel about rest. But I think, we're all kind of works in progress in lots of these topics, and how we think about them and how we reflect on them.
Absolutely. But I do think it's a really powerful, and something as women we need to be intentional about doing, is crafting our rest in our 20s, because life just does get harder and you do get more responsibilities as you get older. And I think, having seen older women and our mums, right, and whatever, You need those. It's so helpful, because I think our generation is just being more mindful about rest anyway than the generation above us. But I feel like it's going to serve us so well to have found our tools for what rest is for us personally at this stage in our lives to carry into when, you know, ultimately you just get less and less time as you get older. And yeah, I just think it's a really important thing for us to, and I'm saying this to myself as well, it's really important for us to just continuously figure out how to rest, because life just, yeah, it does get harder as you get older, and also more magical and brilliant and amazing. But yeah.
Absolutely. Well, I think that's a fab note to end on. So thank you very much for joining us today, Ellie, and sharing all your thoughts. And yeah, it's been great to catch up with you.
Thank you for having me.
Bye.
Bye.